Hi, welcome to Street Priest Ministries. I'm your host, Brother Jay, as we're taking the Gospels back to the streets. Today's drive-through message is the Book of Enoch. And we're continuing. This is part number 5 in a series of 5 videos for each part. And after this, I saw another dream. And I will show the whole dream to thee, my son. And Enoch lifted up his voice and spake to his son Methuselah, to thee, my son, will I speak. Hear my words, incline thine ear to the dream vision of thy father. Before I took thy mother Edna, and I saw a vision on my bed, and behold, a bull came forth from the earth, and that bull was white. And after it came forth a heifer, that's a female sheep. And after that forth came a heifer, and along, it's a baby sheep at that, female baby sheep. And along with this latter came forth 2 bulls, one of them black and the other red. And the black bull gored the red one, and pursued him over the earth. And thereupon I could no longer see the red bull, and that black bull grew, and that heifer went with him. And I saw that many oxen proceeded from him, which resembled and followed him. And that cow, the first one, went from the presence of that first bull in order to seek that red one, but found him not, and lamented with a great lamentation over him, and sought him. And I looked till the first bull came to her and quieted her, and from that time onward she cried no more. And from that time on she cried no more. And after that she bore another white bull, and after him she bore many bulls and cows and black cows. And I saw in my sleep that the white bull likewise grew and became a great white bull, and from him proceeded many white bulls, and they resembled him. And it began to beget many white bulls, which resembled them, one following the other, even many. And I saw again with my eyes as I slept, and I saw the heaven above, and behold, a star fell from heaven, and it arose and ate the pasture among the oxen. And after that I saw a large and black oxen, and the black oxen, behold, they all changed their stalls and pastures, and their cattle, and went to live with each other. And again I saw in a vision, and looked towards the heaven, and behold, saw many stars descend, and cast themselves down from heaven to that first star. And they became bulls among those cattle, and pasteurized with them amongst them. And I looked at them, and saw, and behold, they all let out their privy members like horses. They're well hung, is what he's saying, the translation. And I looked and saw, and behold, they let out their privy members like horses, and began to cover the cows of the oxen, and they all became pregnant, and bare elephants, camels, and asses, the hybrids. And all the oxen feared them, and were frightened at them, and began to bite with their teeth, and to devour, and to gore with their horns. And they began moreover to devour those oxen. And behold, the children of the earth began to tremble and quake before them, to flee from them. And again I saw how they began to gore each other, and to devour each other, and the earth began to cry aloud. It's talking about, of course, those fallen angels mixing with the women. That's why they represented the stars of heaven coming down. The star usually represents angels. They were fallen. There was 200 that we read about earlier that made it with the women and produced these giants, hybrids. And they began to eat mankind. They were carnivorous. And the whole earth was filled with violence. And I raised my eyes again to heaven, and I saw in a vision, and behold, there came forth from heaven beings who were like white men. And 4 went forth from the place, and 3 with them. And those 3 that had last come forth grasped me by my hand, and took me up away from the generations of the earth, and raised me up to a lofty place, and showed me a tower raised high above the earth, and all the hills were lower. And one said to me, remain here till thou seest everything that befalls those elephants, camels, and asses, and the stars, and the oxen, and all of them. And I saw, one of those who had come forth first, and he seized me, that first star which had fallen from heaven, and bound it, and bound it hand and foot, and cast it into an abyss. Now that abyss was narrow and deep, and horrible and dark. And one of them drew a sword and gave it to those elephants and camels and asses. Then they began to smite each other. Remember what God said? He was going to have the giants kill each other off, and he was going to let the angels, the fallen angels that begat these giants, see their death, their demise first, before he put a hood over them and bound them where they couldn't look up to heaven and sit in darkness waiting for their judgment. Then they began to smite each other, and the whole earth quaked because of them. And as I was beholding in the vision, lo, one of the 4 who had come forth stoned them. That's one of the angels. Remember the 4 angels, Michael, Gabriel, Puniel, or Raphael, excuse me. And the whole earth quaked because of them. And as I was beholding in a vision, lo, one of the 4 who had come forth stoned them from heaven, and gathered and took all the great stars, whose private members were like that of horses. They were well hung like horses. I mean, that's why the women went for them. And bound them all hand and foot, and cast them in an abyss of the earth. And one of those 4 went to the white bull and instructed him in secret, without his being terrified. He was born a bull, and became a man, and built for himself a great vessel, and dwelt thereon. And 3 bulls dwelt with him in that vessel, and they were covered in, talking about Noah and his 3 sons. And again, I raised mine eyes towards heaven, and saw a lofty roof with 7 water torrents thereon, whose torrents flowed with much water into an enclosure. And I saw again, and behold, fountains were opened up on the surface of the great enclosure, that water began to swell and rise up on the surface. And I saw an enclosure till all the surface was covered with water. And the water, the darkness, and the mist increased upon it, as I looked at the height of that water. That water had risen above the height of the enclosure and was streaming over the enclosure. It stood up on the earth, and all the cattle of that enclosure were gathered together until I saw how they sank and were swallowed up and perished in the water. They drowned them in the flood. But that vessel floated on the water, Noah's ark, while all the oxen and the elephants and camels and asses sank to the bottom with all the animals, so that I could no longer see them. And they were not able to escape, but perished and sank in the depths. And again I saw in a vision till those water torrents were removed from the high roof, and the chasms of the earth were leveled up, and another abyss was opened. Then the waters began to run down. It's like God had a drainage system. You know how you unplug the drain in the tub and let the water out. It's something similar. Till the earth became visible. But that vessel settled on the earth. Mount Ararat is actually where it settled. It's been discovered. Noah's Ark. Ron Wyatt discovered it. You can go on my site and look at it. On my social media sites. Till the earth became visible. But that vessel settled on the earth, and the darkness retired, and light appeared. But that white bull which had become a man, that's Noah, out of that vessel, and 3 bulls with him, that's his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, came out of the vessel, and the 3 bulls with him. And one of those 3 was white, like the bull. So, now Noah produced all the races of the earth, and those 3 men represented all the races of the earth. And obviously one was white. And one of those 3 was white like him. So Noah was white too, like the bull. And one of them was red as blood, where you got the red man. That was Japheth, that was the red man. Was the red man was Japheth. And one was black, and that was Ham. And that white bull departed from them. And they began to bring forth beasts of the field, that bringing all the animals out of the ark, and birds, so that there arose different generations of tigers, wolves, dogs, hyenas, wild boars, foxes, squirrels, swine, falcons, vultures, kites, eagles, and ravens. Among them was born a white bull, and they began to bite one another. But that white bull which was born amongst them begat a wild ass, and a wild bull with it. And the wild asses multiplied. But that bull which is born from him begat a black wild boar, and a white sheep, and begat black wild boar, and a white sheep. And the former begat many boars, but that sheep begat 12 former boars, but that sheep begat 12 sheep. And when those 12 sheep had grown, they gave up one of them to the asses. And those asses again gave up the sheep to the wolves. And that sheep grew up among the wolves. And the Lord brought the 11 sheep to live with it to the pasture, with among the wolves. And they multiplied and became many flocks of sheep. And the wolves begat to fear them, and they oppressed them until they destroyed their little ones. And they cast their young into the river of much water. But those sheep began to cry aloud on account of their little ones, and complain unto the Lord. And the sheep which had been saved from the wolves fled and escaped to the wild asses, and begat the sheep how they lamented and cried, and besought their Lord with all their might, till the Lord of the sheep descended at the voice of the sheep from a lofty abode, and came down to them and pastured them. He's talking obviously about the descendants of Shem, which turned into Abraham, and which turned into the 12 tribes of Israel. They multiplied and with Joseph and went down to Egypt because of the famine, and they was enslaved, or the wolves enslaved them, the Egyptians, for 400 years. And after that, they were led forth out of there by Moses, and God came down on Mount Sinai to deal with his people, his chosen people. That's the parable, pretty much. And I saw the sheep how they lamented and cried, and besought the Lord with all their might, till the Lord of the sheep descended at the voice of the sheep from a lofty abode, and came down to them and pastured them. And he called that sheep which had escaped the wolves, and spake with it concerning the wolves, that it should admonish them not to touch the sheep. And the sheep went to the wolves according to the word of the Lord. And another sheep met it and went with it. And the two went and entered together into the assembly of those wolves, and spake with them and admonished them not to touch the sheep from henceforth. That's Moses and Aaron. They're the ones that went in. There's the sheep. They're simple shepherds. They were shepherds. And the sheep, when another sheep met it and went with it, and the two went and entered together into the assembly of the wolves, that's Pharaoh, and spake with them, and admonished them not to touch the sheep from henceforth. And thereupon I saw the wolves, how they oppressed the sheep exceedingly with all their power. And the sheep cried aloud. They were going through cruel slavery. Pharaoh of Egypt. Excuse me. And I saw the wolves, how they oppressed the sheep exceedingly with all their power. And the sheep cried aloud, and the Lord came to the sheep, and they began to smite those wolves. And the wolves began to make lamentation. God poured his wrath out on Egypt with the 10 plagues of Egypt, and ended up killing their firstborn as the last of the 10 plagues, all the firstborn of Egypt, all the firstborn sons of Egypt. And thereupon I saw the wolves, and how they oppressed the sheep accordingly with all their power. And the sheep cried aloud, and the Lord came to the sheep, and they began to smite those wolves. And the wolves began to make lamentation. But the sheep became quiet, and forthwith ceased to cry out. And I saw the sheep till they departed from amongst the wolves. But the eyes of the wolves were blinded. And those wolves departed. God hardened their heart. He said he hardened the heart of Pharaoh. He hardened the heart of Pharaoh to pursue him to his own demise. He got drowned in the Red Sea. Obviously, he got deported to the Red Sea, and they thought they could go through, like the children of Israel, to the other side of Midian, and God closed the sea on them, and they drowned. And I saw the sheep, and they departed from amongst them, but the eyes of the wolves were blinded. And those wolves departed in pursuit of the sheep with all their power. And the Lord of the sheep went with them as their leader. Remember, God was over them as a cloud of fire by night, gave them light, and a cloud in the daytime. And the Lord of the sheep went with them as their leader. And all his sheep followed him, and his face was dazzling. Remember, Moses couldn't even look upon the glory of the Lord. He had to cover himself from the power of his presence. Matter of fact, to look upon a guy was to see death because you're a sinner. You weren't supposed to even look upon. God had Moses covers his eyes or God actually covered his eyes as he walked past. Let him see his derriere, but he couldn't look at him in his face. But the eyes of the wolves were blinded, and those wolves departed in pursuit of the sheep with all their power. They pursued after the Egyptians. And the Lord of the sheep went with them as their leader, and all his sheep followed him, and his face was dazzling and glorious and terrible to behold. But the wolves began to pursue those sheep till they reached a sea of water, the Red Sea. And the sea was divided, and the water stood on this side and on that before their face. And the Lord led them and placed himself between them and the wolves. Remember, God caused a dark fog or something, or a cloud, to confuse them. He got behind Israel, and they were blinded. They couldn't see because of the darkness. God fought for his people. And the sea was divided. Okay. And the sea was divided, and the water stood on this side and on that side before their face. And the Lord led them and placed himself between them and the wolves. And as these wolves did not yet see the sheep, they proceeded into the midst of the sea. And the wolves followed the sheep, and those wolves ran after them into the sea. And when they saw the Lord of the sheep, they turned to flee before his face. But that sea gathered itself together and became as it had been created. In other words, the water went back into place and swallowed them up. And you can see those chariot wheels still this day at the bottom of the Red Sea affair. Like I said, Ron Wyatt discovered all that. It's well documented. And that sea was divided. And as those wolves did not see yet, the water proceeded into the midst of the sea, and the wolves followed the sheep. And those wolves ran after them into the sea. And when they saw the Lord of the sheep, they turned to flee before his face. But the sea gathered itself together and became as it had been created, and the water swelled and rose till it covered those wolves. And I saw till the wolves who pursued the sheep perished and were drowned. But the sheep escaped from the water and went forth into the wilderness, where there was no water and no grass. And they remember the wilderness of sin. And they began to open their eyes and to see. And I saw the Lord of the sheep pasturing them and giving them water and grass. He gave them actually water and manna. Water and grass that the sheep going and that kept the sheep going and leading them. And that sheep ascended to the summit of the lofty rock, and the Lord of the sheep sent it to them. And after that I saw the Lord of the sheep who stood before them, and his appearance was great and terrible and majestic. And all those sheep saw him and were afraid before his face, and they all feared and trembled because of him. And they cried to the sheep with whom was amongst them, Moses, "We are not able to stand before our Lord or to behold him." And that sheep which led them again ascended to the summit of the rock. Remember, Moses went back up to the mountain, Mount Sinai. That the sheep which led them again ascended to the summit of the rock. And the sheep began to be blinded and to wander from the way which he had showed them. Remember, they had created a golden calf, and Had an orgy at the foot of the mountain. I told him that already. Get the what was that? The four prophets, the Moses series. And that sheep which led them again ascended to the summit of the rock, but the sheep began to be blinded and to wander from the way which he had showed them. But that sheep would not thereof, he wasn't aware of it. And the Lord of the sheep was wrathful. God told Moses, get down to the foot of the mountain. The people were sinning and worshiping idols, worshiping the golden calf that Aaron built for him, Pastor Aaron, people's pastor. And the Lord of the sheep was wrathful, exceedingly against him. And the sheep discovered it, and went down from the summit of the rock, and came to the sheep, and found the greatest part of them blinded and fallen away. And when they saw it, they feared and trembled at its presence, and desired to return to their foes. And that sheep took other sheep with it, and came to those sheep which had fallen away, and began to slay them. Moses killed 3,000 of them with a sword at the foot of the mountain. So this is a very accurate vision that he had. Now remember, he saw this. Enoch envisioned this approximately 2,000, 2,300 years, maybe somewhere in that time frame before it happened. Because I'm about right, about 2,300 years, 2,400 years. He saw this in advance about the Exodus. And I saw in a vision till the sheep became a man and built a house for the Lord. And the sheep feared his presence. Thus the sheep brought back those sheep that had fallen away, and they returned to their foes. And I saw in a vision till the sheep became a man and built a house for the Lord of the sheep, and placed all the sheep in that house. And I saw all the sheep which had met that sheep which led them fall asleep. And I saw till all the great sheep perished, and the little ones arose in their place. And they began to pasture. And they came to a pasture, and approached a stream of water. Then that sheep, their leader, which had become a man, withdrew from them, and fell asleep. All the sheep saw it and cried over it with a great crying. And I saw till they left off crying, for the sheep had crossed that stream of water. And there arose the two sheep as leaders in the place of that which had led them and fallen asleep. So Moses died. And Moses couldn't take them over to the promised land. And that was up to Joshua and Caleb. They're the one that took his place. And those arose two sheep as leaders in the place of that one which had led them and fallen asleep. Little had fallen asleep that had led them. And I saw till the sheep came to a goodly place, the land of milk and honey, Canaan, and a pleasant and glorious land. And I saw all those sheep were satisfied, and that house stood amongst them in a pleasant land. And sometimes their eyes were open and sometimes closed. Now they're going through the book of Judges, when they were evil sometimes, and they repented, and God sent them into bondage for worshiping idols, and they came out forth through either Samson, Gideon, judges like that, Samuel, until they got around to their first king that they begged God for, which was Saul. David was the second king. And sometimes their eyes were open and sometimes blinded, till another sheep arose and led them, and brought them all back, and their eyes were open. And the dogs and the foxes and the wild boars began to devour the sheep That's the enemies, the Midianites, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Canaanites. They were surrounded. And God would let their enemies have, every time they backslid, God would let the enemies have their way with them. And the dogs and the foxes and the wild boars began to devour those sheep, till the Lord of the sheep raised up another sheep, another judge, a ram from their midst, which led them. And the ram began to butt on either side those dogs, foxes, and boars, till he had destroyed them all. And that sheep, whose eyes were open, saw that the ram which was amongst the sheep, till it forsook its glory, and began to butt those sheep, and trample up on them, and behave itself unseemly. And the Lord of the sheep sent the lamb to another lamb, and raised it to being a ram, and a leader of the sheep, instead of that ram which had forsaken its glory. More than likely talking about Saul, the one that turned on the Lord. And he said his heart wasn't right. So God raised up David. And began to butt those sheep and trample on them and behave unseemly. And the Lord of the sheep sent the lamb to another lamb, and raised it up being a ram, and a leader of the sheep instead of that ram which had forsaken its glory. And it came to pass, and it went into it and spake to it alone, and raised it to being a ram, and made it the prince and leader of the sheep. For doing all these things, those dogs oppressed the sheep. And the first ram pursued the second ram. That's Saul pursuing David. And the Philistines are probably the dogs he's talking about. They oppressed the sheep, and the first ram pursued the second ram. And the second ram arose and fled before it. And I saw